My name is Thomas Leighton, and this video presentation is a response to a video done by Soteriology 101 entitled Calvinism and Apologetics Don't Mix. Now, there's several reasons why I decided to do a video response to this. The first is that the individuals, Braxton Hunter and Leighton Flowers, are both professors at Trinity Theological Seminary. Braxton Hunter is the president of the seminary, and I am a Calvinist, and I have 2 degrees from Trinity Theological Seminary. And one of the criticisms I frequently hear from them is that Calvinism cannot respond to them. Calvinism can't offer a response. And so I just decided that, you know what, I will offer a response to it. And hopefully anybody who watches this will benefit in some way from this. I'm not necessarily trying to convince the other side that I'm right and they're wrong. I'm more or less trying to just provide a response from a Calvinistic perspective. Now, I know that Calvinism itself is not monolithic, that there's different perspectives within Calvinism. So this is just the response I'm giving. I'm not saying this applies to everybody. I'm just providing my own response. And I titled this Human Nature and the Problem of Evil, because I really believe that understanding who we are as humans and the problem of evil are what are the topics really to be addressed. So the criticism that is offered against Calvinism by Leighton Flowers and Braxton Hunter is that Calvinism and compatibilism lead to man being a robot, moral robot. That Calvinism and compatibilism lead to God being a moral monster. The only way for man to be truly free is to have, if man has libertarian free will. The only way for God to be justified for allowing this world to have evil, the world that is evil, is if man has libertarian free will. I also want to just mention that what I find to be a category error. So oftentimes what they do is they try to say that naturalistic determinism, otherwise known as physical determinism, is the same as divine determinism or divine causal determinism. And I don't believe this is the case at all. They're very, very different. You can't just lump, just because it's determinism, a form of determinism, lump them in the same together as being the same. I think they tend to do that a lot. So I wanted to bring that up. So according to both Dr. Flowers and Dr. Hunter, since Calvinism and compatibilism lead to God making man sin, so it must be rejected and does not provide a robust worldview. Libertarian free will is the solution and allows for an answer to the problem of evil. Therefore, Calvinism is false, and libertarian free will must be consistent with the fullness of Christian theism. Now, I believe that's essentially in the video that they did entitled Calvinism and Apologetics Don't Mix. You could search it on YouTube. Is that ultimately Calvinism fails, compatibilism fails, because man is essentially a robot, God is essentially a moral monster, and we need libertarian free will, or else, God's a monster and we're robots. We can't make choices for ourselves. So, the response that I'm going to need to give, in order that I'm going to try to give in this video, I need to explain why compatibilism does maintain a true sense of freedom of choice. Now, again, I'm saying freedom of choice. I'm not saying free will. Now, there could be some nuanced differences there. People might say they're the same. I'm mentioning freedom of choice. 2, I need to demonstrate how libertarian free will is not a better and more robust choice for a Christian philosophy of life. And 3, I need to demonstrate how presuppositional apologetics can respond to the problem of evil. because that's one of the things they said. They said that Calvinism cannot really respond to the problem of evil. So, typically within this debate, what I've noticed is this is a debate about God's sovereignty and man's freedom. Typically, and it's often stated that these two are in competition with one another. The other thing is it tends to be a zero sum game. Either God is sovereign or I am free. So to the degree that I'm free, God is not really sovereign over that area. So zero sum game. My interests, I win. Your interests. So if I win or I lose, you win or you lose. So it's one or the other. We are opponents. When I win, you lose, and when you win, I lose. So there cannot be. There's no win-win situation in a zero-sum game. So what is zero-sum game again? In game theory and economic theory, zero-sum game is a mathematical representation of a situation in which each participant's gain or loss of utility is exactly balanced by the losses or gains of the utility of the other participant. So it's kind of like what I said. You have on the one side one person winning, and when that person's winning, the other person's losing. There's no win-win or lose-lose. There's a win or a loss. There's an either or with the game theory in the zero-sum game. So typically what we see here then is option one, God's sovereignty is limited by man's freedom. Man's moral and rational capacities are withdrawn from the eternal decree of God and given an independent and autonomous significance and existence. Now in the video, they are very critical of God's decree, especially with man's choices being involved in the decree of God. So I think this is a very accurate definition I'm providing. I hope they would agree with it. So option one is the option. So I'm going to talk about this this case for soft libertarian free will. The human agent is the sole and ultimate cause of the choice. We are given the ability by God to create our own choices ex nihilo. That's out of nothing. Similarly to how God created the world out of nothing or ex nihilo. We are the only ones in control of our choices. And they are independent of our nature, desires, psychological makeup, character, level of spiritual maturity, um, and intellectual capabilities. I think it also can be added that it's also independent of our memory. I think that's an important thing we don't want to forget either. So option two, this is the typical second option, okay? Man's freedom is eliminated by God's sovereignty. Man's moral and rational capacities are wholly determined by the eternal decree of God and cease to have any real significance or existence at all. And this is what is being, what they are claiming of Calvinism, of compatibilism, is option two. So I think this is accurate to what they're saying about what compatibilism is. So I put this funny little this little thing here, Calvinism hashtag Some Lives Matter, and it's just to be kind of funny. It's but that's really what they think. They're going to think that way. So what I am proposing is what's called a non-zero sum. So my interests, I win. Your interests, you lose. Overlapping interests, win-win. So I'm saying that there can be overlapping involved with the decrees of God and human responsibility. So option three, the option I am entertaining here and that I'm wanting to provide. Man's freedom is established by God's sovereignty. Man's moral and rational capacities are created and maintained within the eternal decree of God, and therefore have real existence and significance. So we have Westminster Confession of Faith. God, from all eternity, by his most wise and holy counsel, of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordained whatsoever comes to pass. Yet, so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. Now, I think the definition I provided is consistent with the Westminster Confession of Faith. And this is a quote from Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics. It says, "It must be sought in the fact that God, because he is God and the universe is his creation, by the infinitely majestic activity of his knowing and willing, does not destroy, but instead creates and maintains the freedom and independence of his creatures." So he maintains it. He's the one that allows it to happen. It doesn't happen by accident. We're not choosing to do stuff, and it's outside of God's knowledge and understanding of what's going to happen in God's purposes. Okay, so we have here from Berkhof's Systematic Theology. In the case of some things, um, God decided not merely that they would um, that they would that they would come to pass, but that he himself would bring them to pass, either immediately as in the work of creation, or through the mediation of secondary causes, which are continually energized by his power. He himself assumes the responsibility for their coming to pass. There are other things, however, which God included in his decree, and thereby rendered certain, but which he did not decide to effectuate himself, as the sinful acts of his rational creatures. The decree, and so far as it pertains to these acts, is generally called God's permissive decree. This name does not imply that the fruition of these acts is not certain to God, but simply that he permits them to come to pass by the free agency of his rational creatures. God assumes no responsibility for these sinful acts whatsoever. So here he's distinguishing two different parts of God's decree. One of them being the fact that God permits people to sin. God allows people to sin. And yeah, it's still a certain act because God knew it beforehand. God allowed it to happen, and God has a purpose for it. So another quote by um, by Charles Hodge in his Systematic Theology: "The decretive will of God concerns his purpose, relates to the fruition of events. The perceptive will relates to the rule of duty for his rational creatures. He decrees whatever he purposes to effect or to permit. He prescribes, according to his own will, what his creatures should do or abstain from doing. The decretive and the perceptive will of God can never be in conflict. God never decrees to do or to cause others to do what he forbids. He may, as we see he does, decree to permit what he forbids. He permits men to sin, although sin is forbidden. This is more scholastically expressed by the theologians by saying a positive decretive will cannot consist with a negative prescriptive will. God cannot decree to make men sin, but a negative decretive will may consist with an affirmative perceptive will. God may command men to repent and believe, and yet, for wise reasons, abstain from giving them repentance. So this is some question and answer here. Um, so it says here, question, but if God predetermines the choices that men make, then they are not truly free choices, since men cannot help but to do what God has ordained. If, in which case, men are merely puppets without moral responsibility for what they do. How can you reconcile God's sovereign foreordination with man's free will? I think this is regarding the topic and regarding what is going on in this conversation. I think this is a very important question, and there's two different answers. Bonson provided some. Says first, he says it seems that many people make the mental mistake of thinking that God's sovereign plan and control over the things in the world somehow changes the very character and operation of those things. Thus, if God sovereignly predetermines how a man will use his volition, his free will, then man's volition is no longer really his volition. His free will is not actually free, but such reasoning is volition. fallacious. And Braxton goes on to talk about why it's fallacious. Take, for an example, the bones of Jesus. We know from biblical teaching that Jesus had a genuine human body. Thus, his bones were real human bones, made of the same material as anybody else's bones and capable of breaking. He did not have steel or super divine bones. Yet the Bible declared in advance that his bones would not be broken. John 19:36. God predetermined that the bones of Jesus would not be broken. But in so doing, God did not alter the nature of those bones as bones. They did not mysteriously become unbreakable material. They still were regular bones. So that's important to notice that God made a decree. Part of his decree was that the bones of Jesus would not be broken. In doing so, God did not change the course of how nature works. He did not make Jesus' bones like metal or iron or some strong metal or super hard. They were still same bones as like anybody else's, made of the same stuff that everybody else's bones are made of. So he wasn't changing the course of nature in that way. So if God's not doing that with the bones, then we can make the same connection to our free will. If God is ordaining certain things to come to pass, he's having it part of his purpose that we will act in a certain way freely. We're going to do it according to our own volition, according to who we are as people, who we are as spiritual, as a physical being, as psychological, emotional, uh, regarding our memory and past experiences, that this is a choice that we're going to make freely without being coerced by God. So let's go to this next. Similarly, when the Bible teaches us that God foreordains the free decisions of men, made by men, we should not infer that those free decisions were not really free after all. Men's volitions remains just that, his volitions. God is able, according to biblical teaching and reasoning, to determine in advance that a man will exercise his free will in a particular way, and the man freely does so without force or compulsion. The man genuinely chooses to do what God had already foreordained. I think this is important to understand what Bonson's saying here, and you can look up this article if you go to you can Google it, cross examination for nation of free will. It's under it's in the website Covenant Media Foundation, I believe is where it is, CMF, and you can search cross examination Bonson and search this article for yourself and read it. And I highly advise people to do so. So there's another question that Bonson presents, and that one is, but doesn't the Bible teach that man does not have a free will, but a will in which is enslaved to sin? And this is important because the biblical teaching of those who are in Adam or those who are in Christ and the sin nature that's often talked about by theologians. And the answer Bonson provides is this: when we talk about man's quote unquote free will in a setting like this one, we must remember that we are simply saying that a person's actions or choices are voluntary, genuinely under his control, and such that he has the outward ability to do other than what he actually chose to do. We can call this metaphysically free will. A person's choices are self-determined rather than forced um, or compelled. To affirm this is not to say that man has a morally free will. The Bible teaches that unregenerate men are not free to do good in God's sight. They are morally incapacitated, so that all their choices, and they are genuine choices, will fall short of pleasing God and will fail to live up to his holy standards. Morally speaking, man's will is in bondage to sin's desires. It's not free. And this is just to say, a dad can go out and take his son out to go play catch football or catch baseball or whatever, And that, in and of itself, it's, we would think that, oh yeah, he's bonding with his son, doing a good thing. Now, an unbeliever doing that is still in sin against God, because he's not acknowledging and not thankful for the fact that he's doing this as a creature, and doing this based upon God allowing him to do it. He's doing it in rebellion to God. So he's still in sin against God. He's not committing murder or rape or anything like that, but his heart is still enslaved in sin. So the problem restated. Both Leighton Flowers and Braxton Hunter don't even actually argue against compatibilism, but um, it's just a case of begging the question by assuming libertarian free will. Now, they don't actually argue against it. They just state that, well, Calvinists and compatibilists, we just believe that God controls everything. God makes people sin. And they assume that libertarian free will from the start. The physical determinism affirmed by naturalists is very different from the theological determinism affirmed by Calvinists. I said this at the beginning. This is kind of a category error that they make, is that they assume that there's this connection between determinism and naturalism. And I think that, if you watch the video, there's a part of the video where there's a dialogue that they're showing between a Calvinist and an atheist. Now, it's not a very good conversation, especially from the Calvinist perspective, because the Calvinist doesn't really make any distinctions, doesn't really provide any meaningful dialogue, as far as I'm concerned. But one of the things that happens, and this is kind of the payoff from our perspective, is I often think to myself that, well, these guys, seem like they always put us in the boat of, well, we're agreeing with naturalism. But if you listen to there's the same argument that Braxton Hunter and Leighton Flowers make, this atheist is making. The very same points are being made. So it's actually more of and even in the course of the conversation, the atheist mentions deism. Now, if I were to act and treat the position of Leighton Flowers and Braxton Hunter like they treat my position, I would be saying that they act more like deists than they do theists. Now, I'm not going to do that because I want to make actual beneficial conversation here. I don't want to just make logical errors and category errors and assume that they're deists, because they're not. But I find that very interesting that this happened. I think that's an interesting payoff from a perspective of a Calvinist like myself. Is that, have thought it oftentimes that what seems like they're arguing and they're supporting in this argument against Calvinism, they're almost supporting and doing an argument that a naturalist and an atheist would do. And lo and behold, they show a video where that exact thing does happen. So we're moving on. The zero balance argument for libertarian free will. And you could Google this. Braxton Hunter has a website where he published this, I think it's back about 5 years ago, but it's called the zero balance argument for libertarian free will. So the premises, as stated, premises and conclusions. If man has a zero balance of influence, the man is the unmoved mover to his choices, free to choose and make choices ex nihilo. Now, I will admit up front, I'm providing, I'm restating this argument to include unmoved mover and ex nihilo, because that's actually more accurate representation of their position. If you listen to the debate between um, Jonathan Pritchett and Leighton Flowers with the hard determinists, you'll see towards the end of the debate that Leighton Flowers mentions that our ability to make choices is similar to God's choosing to create the universe ex nihilo. So I believe and I've heard other people in favor of libertarian free will use the idea of we are the unmoved mover of our choices. So I'm using this, I think, in a very accurate manner. So, one, if man has a zero balance of influence, then man is the unmoved mover to his choices, free to choose and make choices ex nihilo. Now, with zero balance is essentially saying that there's really no influences coming into making that choice. We're making it based upon our own libertarian free will. We're choosing it ourselves, spontaneous. There is no other factors involved to make this choice. So 2, man does have a zero balance of influence. And 3, therefore, man is the unmoved mover to his choices, free to choose and make choices ex nihilo. So that's the argument stated. So this is a quote from the article. There is no reason to reject the idea that in a world with zero balance of influence, the agent himself uh, could will to or cause something that he determines to happen. Thus, this is not a situation wherein cause and effect does not exist, yet man can be said to have transcended cause and effect, and that his decision is the cause of the following effect. Only his cause did not arise coercively because of the cause and effect inherent in the influences um, he perceives, since there is a zero balance of influence. There's nothing outside of this choice and acting on this choice that is making this choice happen. And I believe that includes like past memory and experiences cannot play a role in it. Our psychological makeup can't play a role in it. If we have severe mental illnesses, if we have addictions, all that stuff, this is all because that's all based upon external coercions on us. So there's a zero balance where there's no pull on us. So the case against zero balance influence, there does there does appear to be instances of influences that cause us to make decisions like drug use. Maybe at first a person chooses to make the choice for drug use, but then there becomes more. It becomes more influence from outside. This pull, this desire to do it increases. Then these people have to recognize what triggers from the external triggers that cause these people to relapse into the substance abuse again. A zero balance does not appear to take into account that man is a personal, spiritual, psychological, emotional, and physical creatures. So what I'm bringing here is that one of the things that Braxton Hunter does in his article is he kind of makes this assumption of substance dualism. And there has to be this substance dualism, and it's the immaterial part of us that he's speaking of that is making this decision. And I don't think that's really an accurate depiction of who humanity is. And I can get more into my disagreement with substance dualism at another time. But I think this assumption, just because a lot of Christian philosophers and theologians are substance dualists, that we have to adopt a position of substance dualism. I think there's other. Bonson has an article on the mind-body problem from a Christian perspective. Now he's not taking on the perspective of Christian physicalism and a physical and materialistic physicalism, but he also acknowledges that there's not this, as Bonson puts it, this ghost in the machine, as it were, that there's this mind independent of a body and independent of who we are as persons. I see it as we are more holistic creatures. We are creatures that have a physical body. We are spiritual. Um, we are also personal. We are rational. And there's a lot of that. We're emotional beings. There's a lot that make up who we are. It's not just this soul independent of a body, that is in a body. We are holistic beings. I see it. I definitely see it as all of that plays a factor of who we are. And I don't think that libertarian free will takes that into account. So zero balance, causation, and memory. Memory plays a role in our decision making process. So